Good morning, or depending on when you're watching this, good afternoon, good evening, or good night. My name's Ross, and as always told, out of Voice of Radio. So today we need to be taking a look at a buy list for Paradox Rift. Paradox Rift is out now. It's probably been out for like a day by the time you hear this. It is time to have a chat about the cards you need to pick up. But a quick reminder what I'm talking about with my buy list here. I'm not necessarily saying go and pick up stuff like Roaring Moon. And it's not because I don't think you should get Roaring Moon, and it's not because I don't think Roaring Moon's not good. I do think it's good. Too many negatives there. What I'm saying is, you're either going to play Roaring Moon or you're not. And Roaring Moon is not going to be a cheap card. So if you're going to play Roaring Moon, like I am, go pick up 4 of these, like I'm going to. If you're not, don't. By the same token, something like Steelix. You know if you're going to be playing Steelix or not. I'm not going to be talking about main attackers here because not everybody wants to play every deck. What I'm talking about here are the cards you need to have in your binder so you can go and buy your main attackers and then you've got everything else ready to go for whatever you might need and you're not that person scrabbling around last minute for weird techs. We've all seen that person and let's face it, we've all been there. So starting off, you need most of these are 2-ofs because a lot of these are techs. You need yourself Toad Scroll. Toad Scroll's got a rather lovely ability that stops your opponent putting cards from their discard pile into their hand with abilities or trainer effects. If your opponent's starting to play recovery stuff, this will stop them. You need a couple copies of Chi-Yu in Fire decks. Chi-Yu is a great starting Pokemon because you've got single energy and you get to attach a couple energy from your discard pile, which is good, or 2 energy, 140 if you had a Pokemon KO'd last turn. It's clearly very, very nice. Octillery draws your free cards when you play it, and sure, it's a one-shot deal, but we often have other good Octillery, so I think this is a kind of thing where you are going to need a couple copies of it in your binder. Milotic is also got a very interesting ability, which I think could see a bit of play and a bit of love here. Basically, when you evolve into it, you can have both players put a basic from the discard pile onto their bench. Any Pokemon that does extra damage for bench Pokemon, or even if you just think your opponent is about to bench a Pokemon you really don't want them to bench, use this to take away that final bench space. It is a very good Pokemon. Wugtrio, it goes and searches free tools. That's what it does. But you know what? Searching out tools is really good. So, yeah. Also, this time, I'm not putting the name of all the cards at the top because you can see what the cards are. These are all 2-ofs unless I tell you any differently. I think you need a couple copies of Iron Bundle. Iron Bundle's got that amazing ability that lets you discard it and it forces your opponent to switch their active. That is going to be one that sees a bunch of play. Chen Pao, I think, is a brilliant single prizer in decks with water energy acceleration. You can either use it as energy acceleration in the early game, or free energy 130, discard 2 energy from this Pokemon. It's clearly pretty gosh darn good. Oricorio is another great Pokemon in the early game. For single energy, shuffle your hand into your deck, draw a card for each benched Pokemon, yours and your opponent's. In the early game, if you are really struggling to get something going, this can be your friend. I do think you need 1 copy of Tapu Koko. Probably only just the 1, but 2 energy, 120 if you had a Pokemon KO by damage from an attack during your opponent's last turn. It's too good, ladies and gentlemen. It's too good. I do also think you need a couple copies of Iron Hands. And I told you I'm not going to be suggesting main attackers here, and I'm not. But Iron Hands EX is going to be fitting into just so many different archetypes. I do think you're going to need a couple copies of this in your binder, because I think all of us are going to be playing this in a deck at some point. Xatu, I do think you need a full 4 copies of. There's not many I'm going to say this for, but Xatu, I mean, look, you just get to attach a basic Psychic from your hand to one of your bench Pokemon and draw 2 cards. Basically, any Psychic deck from now until this rotates can be made better with this, and that's kind of the point. This is what we're looking at. Cards that you might be playing in a bunch of decks moving forward, and in a few months, a year, whenever, you don't want to be scrabbling around to try and find a bunch of Paradox Rift Xatu. You'll already have them in your binder. Now, Screamtail's another interesting card I think you're going to need a couple copies of. It's got a really nice attack for 2 energy that does 20 damage to one of your opponent's Pokemon for each damage counter on this Pokemon. Really good in any deck that can accelerate energy, get a bit of damage on, put it anywhere. I really like this one. Now, Iron Valiant, I'm not generally a fan of telling you guys that you need to go out and buy EXs because they get a little bit expensive and it makes the buy list actually cost a decent amount of money. You're not going to pay much for most of the cards on this list. Iron Valiant is an exception in both ways. I do think you're going to need it. The ability Tachyon Bits is phenomenal when you get it from the bench to the active. Drop 2 damage counters on one of your opponent's Pokemon. But the problem is, not only is it a phenomenal cards can be ignored. Roaring Moon, you're either going to play it or you're not, that's fine. The difficulty here is that in so many different decks of so many different types and all sorts, that's where Iron Valiant is going to come in, and I do think you need 2 to 4 of these, I am sorry. Similarly, Hooper EX, I think, is an absolute card you're going to need in Darkness decks, potentially. 2 energy, 50 damage for each energy attached to all of your opponent's Pokemon, which, to be fair, is not necessarily just hitting for fighting weakness. That can KO anything. But then 3 energy, 200, and you are hitting for fighting weakness, will KO anything that's weak. It's a really strong tech. Now, Minior is a sneaky great card in this deck. Minior's got the ability Far-Flying Meteor. Once during your turn, if this Pokemon is on your bench, if you attach an energy to it, you get to switch it with the active. But we've seen over the past few years, there are a lot of things out there that stop the defending Pokemon retreating next turn or whatever. This is a way around that. This puts a new Pokemon in the active, so if you're being trapped from getting out the active, don't worry, Minior has absolutely got your back. Decent attack as well for a single energy, 20 for each energy in your opponent's active Pokemon's retreat cost. Great in a pinch, but really here it's the ability. Now, Slitherwing, I do think you're going to need a couple copies of this. 2 fighting energy, 120. Turn 1, going second in a fighting deck. I really, really like that for some early game damage. Now, Sandy Shock CX is another one. I don't like really putting EXs on the buy list, but I think basically every fighting deck I make for the next couple of years, I'm going to put 1 or 2 Sandy Shocks in it. Because the ability lets you, if your opponent has 4 or fewer prize cards remaining, attach a basic fighting from your discard pile to it once during your turn. That's really good. You build up energy on and then you go and smash, and it's actually very good. Absol's got a couple of very useful attacks. One that lets you discard any number of cards in your hand, as long as you get down to 4 or fewer. And then you draw until you have 5 cards in your hand. Good in the early game for just getting yourself set up if you got nothing. And then 2 energy, 20 damage, but if you got a tool attached, 60 more. Really nice for doing good damage, turn 1 going second. Morpeko is actually a card that's already seeing a bunch of play in a bunch of decks. Do not sleep on this one. The ability gives it free retreat if it's got no energy attached. But then for 2 energy, you can do 70 and move the 2 energy to one of your bench Pokemon. It's a nice little tech in Darkness decks. Brute Bonnet is going to be another one. Basically, the ability's great, the attack's terrible. If it's got an Ancient Booster Energy Capsule attached, more on that in a minute, you can make both active Pokemon poisoned. Well, as long as you've got something that can retreat out the active or something along those lines, this is pretty gosh darn good. And there's going to be a bunch of decks playing Ancient Booster Energy Capsule, and this is a basic Pokemon. That's pretty good. Jirachi, we've talked about a lot. Phenomenal card. Protects you from damage counters being dropped. It is going to be useful in a whole bunch of decks. You are going to need a couple. Aegislash is another one. Now, there's an argument this one's more of a deck rather than a tech, so maybe this is a buy if you're going to play it, don't if you're not. But the ability gives it immunity from damage from attacks and Pokemon EX and Pokemon V. That's really good. And we're going to be potentially entering a format post-rotation where this is way better. And then finally, Bombardier EX. I think you might need one of these, probably only ever one. And it's mostly for the attack Fast Carrier. It lets you search for free basic Pokemon and pop them on your bench. But crucially, you can use this turn 1 going first to get yourself completely set up before your opponent's even started. That's pretty good to me. Now, in terms of trainers, general rule here, I think you need a playset of all of them. There are a couple I've left out for fairly obvious reasons. So, Ancient Booster Energy Capsule, I mean, you get an extra 60 HP and immunity from special conditions, plus it interacts with some Pokemon. You're going to need it. Counter Catcher, you might have this from when it was released last time, but it's gusting if you're behind on prizes. As an item card, you'll need a playset. Curse Duster is kind of a weird hand disruption when you get knocked out card, but you never know, some decks might need it. Defiance Vest, if you're behind on prizes, you take 40 less damage, really good in more defensive decks. Earthen Vessel, you discard a card from your hand and search for 2 basic energy. There is an argument this is the best card in the set, and a lot of decks are going to want to play it. Now, Future Boost Energy Capsule, for future decks, it's too gosh darn good. Free retreat and an extra 20 damage. Yeah, this one's pretty ridiculous. Luxurious Cape, you get an extra 100 HP on a non-rulebox Pokemon, but you give up an extra prize. Some decks, this is totally going to be worth it. Mela, if you had a Pokemon knocked out during your opponent's last turn, does not have to be by damage from an attack. Any way it's knocked out is fine. Attach a fire energy, and then draw till you got 6 cards in your hand. And it doesn't have to be to a fire Pokemon. It's really good. Parasol Lady's a weird one to me. I'm putting this at 1 to 4. Because it's only really good turn 1 going second, but if you do, it's a shuffle draw 8, otherwise it's a shuffle draw 4 and it's not as good. But this is one to keep an eye on. Professor Sada's Vitality accelerates energy to 2 ancient Pokemon and then draws 3 cards, going to be a staple in a lot of decks. Professor Turo's Scenario lets you put one of your Pokemon in play into your hand. It's another very good card that's going to see a bunch of play. Rika gets you any 2 cards from the top 4, and it only gets you 2 cards, but it gets you the best 2. There are going to be some decks that really make good use of this. Rourke, I'm putting on here with a question mark because this card might be terrible, but it lets you draw 2, and then put a basic energy from your discard pile into your hand. Maybe some decks will use this. This one is very much on the fringe of terrible and vaguely playable. Snorlax Doll can only be played while you're setting up, but it's a 120 HP Pokemon that doesn't give up a prize and can use TMs. That's really good. Speaking of which, I think you just need 4 of all the TMs. They give you extra attacks, but then they fall off at the end of your turn, but they give you extra attacks. Blindside for free energy does 100 to one of your opponent's Pokemon that's already damaged. Devolution devolves each of your opponent's evolved Pokemon by 1 stage, hopefully knocking a few out in the process. Evolution evolves 2 of your bench Pokemon, which is awesome, and Turbo Energize searches your deck for 2 basic energy and attaches them to your bench Pokemon, great in the early game. Techno Radar searches for 2 future Pokemon after you discard a card from your hand, going to be a staple in every future deck. Tulip, in any Psychic deck, it gets you 4 Psychic Pokemon and basic Psychic energy from your discard pile into your hand. Really, really good recovery. And then Medical Energy, it's a colourless energy that heals 30. Again, this one might be terrible, but I do get the feeling this one could be pretty good, and so I'm popping it on there. So there we go. That's what you need to know. That's your buy list. The whole thing is now up on the screen, and now it's over to you guys. Which of these cards have you picked up? Which are you planning to pick up? Which cards on my list do you think should not be on there? Are there any cards not on my list that you think should be on there? Go nuts in the comment section, but be nice! And then make sure you like this video, subscribe to this channel, follow me on Twitter at TheWasi. That's where we talk about Pokemon and a whole bunch of other card games. And please do consider checking out patreon.com/PTCG Radio, where you can support the channel, get some bonus podcasts, join a Discord, and all kinds of fun things. And get shoutouts on the channel, like the lovely Star of Dav, who's been a supporter of ours for a while now and is a very lovely person. So shout out to them for the support and the loveliness. But by far the most important thing, as always, look after yourselves till next time, would ya? Thank you very much for watching. My name's Ross, and you've been watching PTCG Radio.